On the morning of August 22nd, 1485, a thick mist clung to the marshlands of Leicestershire. The air hung heavy with the smell of wet earth and the metallic tang of fear. Somewhere in that grey dawn, a king woke knowing he might not see another sunrise. Richard III, the last Plantagenet to wear the crown of England, rose from his tent at Ambion Hill and prepared to meet his fate. Across the boggy fields a pretender waited, a man who had spent half his life in exile, who spoke better French than English, whose claim to the throne ran through an illegitimate line made legitimate only by royal decree. Henry Tudor had come to take what he believed was his, and before the sun climbed to its zenith, one of these men would be dead and the other would be king. The battle that followed would last barely 2 hours. Yet in that brief span of violence and chaos, the entire trajectory of English history would pivot. A dynasty that had ruled for over 3 centuries would end in blood and mud. A new house would rise from the carnage, a house that would transform England from a medieval backwater torn by civil war into a Protestant nation-state that would one day command an empire spanning the globe. The Tudors were coming, and nothing would ever be the same. But to understand what happened on that August morning, we must first understand the world that made it possible. For 30 years, England had been tearing itself apart. The Wars of the Roses, that romantic name given to such an unromantic slaughter, had set cousin against cousin, brother against brother, in a brutal contest for the throne. The House of Lancaster, whose symbol was the red rose, had fought the House of York with its white rose, in a series of battles that had decimated the English nobility. Kings had been made and unmade, fortunes had risen and collapsed, and through it all ordinary people had suffered, their fields trampled by armies, their sons pressed into service, their futures mortgaged to the ambitions of great lords. Richard III was the survivor of this carnage. The youngest brother of King Edward IV, he had proven himself a capable warrior and a loyal servant to his family. When Edward died in 1483, leaving behind 2 young sons, Richard was named Lord Protector. What happened next remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Within months, Richard had declared his nephews illegitimate, claiming that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, and had himself crowned king. The 2 princes, Edward and Richard, were lodged in the Tower of London, and then, quite simply, they vanished. Were they murdered on their uncle's orders? Did they die of illness? Were they smuggled abroad to safety? We may never know for certain. What we do know is that their disappearance haunted Richard's reign and provided a rallying cry for his enemies. Across the Channel, in the windswept courts of Brittany and France, Henry Tudor waited and watched. His claim to the throne was tenuous at best. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, was descended from John of Gaunt, the 4th son of Edward III, through a line that had been explicitly barred from the succession. His father, Edmund Tudor, had been the half-brother of King Henry VI, but that connection carried no legal weight. In any ordinary time, Henry Tudor would have been a minor nobleman, perhaps distinguished by his Welsh heritage and his family's service to the Lancastrian cause, but nothing more. These were not ordinary times. Margaret Beaufort was not an ordinary woman. Small, fierce, intensely pious, she had been married at 12 and widowed at 13, pregnant with the son who would become her life's obsession. Through 4 marriages and countless political upheavals, she had kept that son alive, had kept his claim flickering like a candle in a storm. When the princes disappeared, when Richard's support began to erode, Margaret saw her opportunity. She began weaving a web of conspiracy that stretched from the great houses of England to the court of the French king. And at the centre of that web was a promise. If Henry Tudor could take the throne, he would marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, and unite the warring houses at last. It was a gambler's throw, and the odds were long. Henry had perhaps 3,000 men when he landed at Milford Haven on August 7th, 1485. Many were French mercenaries who cared nothing for English politics. Others were Lancastrian exiles who had thrown in their lot with this last desperate hope. As they marched through Wales, gathering supporters, the enterprise must have seemed quixotic. Richard commanded the full resources of the English crown. He had more men, more weapons, more experience. By every measure of military logic, Henry Tudor should have been crushed. But warfare is never merely a matter of numbers. As Richard gathered his forces at Leicester, uncertainty gnawed at his alliance. The Stanley brothers, Thomas, Lord Stanley and Sir William Stanley, commanded a substantial army of their own, and their loyalty was questionable. Thomas Stanley was married to Margaret Beaufort herself. His stepson was marching against the king, yet Stanley had not declared for either side. Richard, suspicious, held Thomas's son as a hostage against his good behaviour. It was a sword's edge, and everyone knew it. The field at Bosworth was a strange place for destiny to make it stand. The ground was uneven, broken by marshes and hillocks that would make cavalry charges treacherous. Richard positioned his forces on the high ground, with the Duke of Norfolk commanding his vanguard. Henry's smaller army approached from the south, with the Earl of Oxford leading his experienced troops, and off to the side, watching and waiting, the Stanleys held their position like wolves observing two wounded stags. The battle began with an exchange of arrows, that familiar English prelude to slaughter. Oxford's men advanced in tight formation, their discipline born of continental warfare. Norfolk's forces met them, and the two sides crashed together in a grinding melee. Men died in the mud, their screams lost in the chaos. And still the Stanleys did not move. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, though separating legend from fact is nearly impossible after 5 centuries. According to the most dramatic accounts, Richard spotted Henry Tudor's standard across the field and made a fateful decision. Rather than wait for the battle's slow arithmetic to determine the outcome, he would settle matters himself. He would kill the pretender with his own hands, and the rebellion would collapse. Gathering his household knights, Richard charged. It was the act of a brave man or a desperate one, perhaps both. Richard's cavalry smashed into Henry's bodyguard with terrible force. Men went down, standards wavered. For a moment it seemed the king's gamble might pay off. Henry Tudor was no warrior. He had spent more time in counting houses and council chambers than on battlefields. If Richard could reach him, could cut him down, everything would change, but he could not reach him. At the crucial moment, Sir William Stanley finally chose his side. His forces struck Richard's exposed flank, and suddenly the hunter became the hunted. Richard's horse was killed beneath him. His crown, that golden circlet he had worn into battle, was knocked from his head. Yet still he fought, according to the chroniclers, refusing offers of a horse to escape, shouting "Treason! Treason!" as the men he'd trusted turned against him. The blows rained down. Richard III, the last English king to die in battle, fell in that muddy field, his body hacked and stripped by his enemies. When they found the crown, so the story goes, it was lodged beneath a hawthorn bush. Lord Stanley retrieved it and placed it upon Henry Tudor's head, there on the battlefield, while the blood was still wet on the grass. "God save King Henry!" the soldiers cried. And just like that, centuries of history snapped closed like a book, and a new chapter began. Henry VII entered London in triumph, but he was not a fool. He understood that his position was precarious. His claim to the throne rested on conquest and blood, not law, and there were others whose claims were stronger. The son of the Duke of Clarence, Edward of Warwick, was still alive. Various Yorkist nobles remained at large, and the great families of England, those proud lords who had made and unmade kings throughout the Wars of the Roses, were watching to see whether this new monarch was worth supporting, or whether he was merely the latest in a long line of transient rulers. Henry's response was methodical, calculating, and ruthlessly effective. He backdated his reign to the day before Bosworth, allowing him to charge those who had fought for Richard with treason. He seized their lands and titles, enriching the crown and impoverishing potential enemies in a single stroke. He imprisoned young Warwick in the Tower, another prince to disappear behind those cold stone walls, and kept him there for the next 14 years. And in January 1486, as promised, he married Elizabeth of York, finally joining the two Roses in a union that was both political necessity and by many accounts genuine affection. The marriage was more than a symbol. Elizabeth was beautiful, intelligent, and beloved by the English people, in a way that Henry, with his cold demeanour and Welsh accent, could never be. Their children would carry the blood of both Lancaster and York, rendering the old quarrel meaningless, and children came quickly. Arthur the heir in 1486, followed by Margaret, Henry, Elizabeth, Mary, Edmund and Catherine, though death would claim several of them in infancy, as death so often did in those days. But peace did not come so easily. The ghosts of the old conflict refused to rest. In 1487, a boy appeared in Ireland, claiming to be Edward of Warwick, miraculously escaped from the Tower. His real name was Lambert Simnel, a baker's son coached by a priest with ambitions of his own. Yet the Yorkist exiles rallied to him, and an army of Irish and Burgundian troops crossed the sea to press his claim. Henry met them at the Battle of Stoke Field, and this time there was no last-minute treachery. The royal forces crushed the rebellion decisively. Simnel, too young to be held fully responsible, was pardoned and put to work in the royal kitchens. It was a characteristic gesture of Henry's reign: clemency when it was safe, severity when it was necessary, and always an eye toward the practical outcome. 4 years later, another pretender emerged, and this one was far more dangerous. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be Richard of York, the younger of the two princes who had vanished from the Tower. His resemblance to Edward IV was striking, and his story, that he had been secretly spirited away while his brother was murdered, was just plausible enough to attract powerful supporters. For nearly a decade, Warbeck wandered from court to court, gathering recognition from the rulers of France, Burgundy, Scotland, and the Holy Roman Empire. Each of these powers had their own reasons for wanting to destabilise England, and Warbeck was a useful tool. Henry responded with a combination of diplomacy and intelligence work that would have impressed any modern spymaster. He infiltrated Warbeck's circles with agents. He negotiated treaties that stripped away foreign support. He tightened security at home until England became a web of informers and watchers. When Warbeck finally landed in Cornwall in 1497, hoping to spark a popular rising, he found only lukewarm support. His forces melted away, and he was captured, eventually confessing that he was not Richard of York but the son of a Flemish boatman. After a failed escape attempt in 1490s, he was hanged, and on the same day, the real Edward of Warwick was beheaded in the Tower, 2 thorns removed at once, and the Yorkist cause finally, definitively dead. By the turn of the 16th century, Henry VII had achieved something remarkable. England was at peace, the treasury was full, Henry was legendarily frugal, and his detailed financial records show a king who personally audited accounts and penny-pinched with obsessive care. The great nobles had been brought to heel, their private armies disbanded, their power channeled into royal service. Trade flourished. The wool cloth industry enriched English merchants and filled the coffers of the crown, and on the international stage England was once again a player to be reckoned with, its alliances sought by the great powers of Europe. But there was a coldness to Henry's reign, a calculating quality that made him respected but not loved. The instruments of his rule, the counsel learned in the law, the aggressive use of bonds and recognizances to keep the nobility in line, smacked of tyranny to many observers. When he suspected disloyalty, his punishments were severe. When he saw an opportunity for profit, he seized it without sentiment. The years after his wife's death in 1503 were particularly harsh. Elizabeth's passing seemed to strip away whatever warmth remained in him. He became suspicious, grasping, increasingly isolated. By the time he died in April 1509, his subjects were ready for something new. What they got exceeded all expectations. Henry VIII was 17 years old when he ascended to the throne, and he seemed to embody everything his father had not been. Where Henry VII was thin, pale, and calculating, Henry VIII was tall, athletic, and magnificently handsome. Where the old king had hoarded his wealth, the new king spent lavishly, on tournaments, on music, on the arts, on all the pleasures that a young Renaissance prince might desire. The contrast was so stark that it seemed less a change of reign than the dawn of a new world. The young Henry was genuinely accomplished. He spoke several languages fluently. He was an excellent musician and composer. Songs attributed to him are still performed today. He could outride, outshoot, and outwrestle most of his courtiers. In an age that valued the ideal of the complete man, the ruler who combined physical prowess with intellectual achievement, Henry V seemed to embody perfection itself. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in wonder at this golden prince. The people of England rejoiced. After the grey frugality of the previous reign, colour and pageantry had returned to the court. Within weeks of his coronation, Henry married Catherine of Aragon, cementing the Spanish alliance that his father had negotiated. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who had united Spain and sponsored Columbus's voyages. She had originally been betrothed to Henry's older brother Arthur, and their marriage had taken place in 1501, when both were barely 15 years old. But Arthur had died just months later. Whether the marriage was consummated would later become a matter of ferocious dispute, and Catherine had remained in England, her status uncertain, as the two kingdoms haggled over her dowry and her future. Now, at last, she was queen. She was 23, poised, intelligent, deeply devout. Her love for Henry was genuine, and in the early years their marriage seemed blessed, but there was a shadow from the beginning, one that would grow and darken until it consumed everything. Catherine's first pregnancy ended in a stillbirth. Then came a son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, born in January 1511, christened with great ceremony, dead within weeks. More pregnancies followed, more losses. A son in 1513, who died the same day he was born. Another son in 1514, dead within hours. And then, in 1516, a daughter, Mary, who survived. But daughters were not what Henry needed. Daughters could not secure the succession or prevent the chaos that might follow if a king died without a male heir. The Wars of the Roses were within living memory. Everyone understood the stakes. While Catherine struggled with her private griefs, Henry occupied himself with the glories of war. In 1513, he led an army into France, seeking to revive English claims to continental territory that stretched back to the 100 Years' War. The campaign was more pageant than conquest, but it yielded a satisfying victory at the Battle of the Spurs and the capture of the town of Tournai. More significant was what happened while Henry was abroad. James IV of Scotland, allied to France, invaded the north of England. At Flodden Field, the English forces under the Earl of Surrey destroyed the Scottish army and killed the Scottish king himself. It was a crushing victory, one that would secure England's northern border for a generation. These were years of confidence and expansion. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Wolsey, rose from humble origins. His father was an Ipswich butcher, to become the most powerful figure in England after the king himself. Cardinal, Archbishop of York, Lord Chancellor, Papal Legate. Wolsey accumulated titles and offices as other men accumulated gold. His wealth was staggering. Hampton Court Palace, which he built for himself before prudently gifting it to Henry, rivaled any royal residence in Europe. His influence over domestic policy was almost total, and in foreign affairs he positioned England as the arbiter of the great rivalry between France and the Holy Roman Empire. The Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520 was the apotheosis of this era. For 2 weeks in June, Henry met with Francis I of France in a valley near Calais, and the two courts competed in displays of magnificence that have never been equalled. Temporary palaces rose from the meadows, their walls hung with cloth of gold and silver. Knights jousted in armour that cost more than a manor house. Musicians played, acrobats performed, the kings themselves wrestled. Henry lost and did not forget the humiliation. When the spectacle ended, nothing had changed politically, but the memory of that golden fortnight lingered as a symbol of a world that still believed in chivalry, in pageantry, in the power of kings to shape reality through sheer magnificence. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Catherine grew older and no son came. Henry began to notice Anne Boleyn, a dark-eyed young woman who had spent years at the French court, and who possessed something more intoxicating than conventional beauty: wit, intelligence, and the will to refuse what other women might have granted. Anne would not be a mistress. If the king wanted her, she let him understand he would have to marry her. And to marry her, he would have to get rid of Catherine. What followed was not, at first, a religious revolution. It was a legal problem. Henry convinced himself, or allowed himself to be convinced, that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the start. She had been his brother's wife, and the Book of Leviticus declared that a man who married his brother's widow would be childless. Never mind that Catherine swore Arthur had never consummated their marriage. Never mind that a papal dispensation had specifically authorised Henry's union with her. The succession of dead sons was proof, Henry believed, of God's displeasure. The only solution was an annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never truly existed. In ordinary circumstances, such matters were handled quietly. Kings sought annulments regularly, and the Pope usually obliged when the petitioner was powerful enough. But these were not ordinary circumstances. In 1527, the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had sacked Rome itself. Pope Clement VII was virtually a prisoner, and Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Any decision that humiliated his aunt would be a decision against the most powerful ruler in Europe. The Pope stalled. He temporised. He commissioned inquiries that went nowhere. Years passed, and nothing changed. Wolsey, who had promised Henry a quick resolution, found his position crumbling. In 1529, the king stripped him of his offices and ordered his arrest on charges of treason. Only death saved him from a worse fate. He died at Leicester Abbey in November 1530, worn out by disgrace and the winter journey south. His fall marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The men who rose to replace him were different in character and outlook. Thomas Cromwell, a blacksmith's son who had reinvented himself as a lawyer and administrator, saw an opportunity in the king's frustration. If Rome would not grant what Henry wanted, then England must break from Rome. The break came in stages, each step building on the last, each justified by precedents real or invented. In 1532, the submission of the clergy placed the English Church under royal authority. In 1533, Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. And by that time, the declaration was urgent, because Anne Boleyn was already pregnant. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy proclaimed Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, and the Act of Succession declared Mary illegitimate and named any children by Anne as heirs to the throne. These were revolutionary acts, and they did not go unresisted. Thomas More, the great humanist scholar who had served as Lord Chancellor after Wolsey's fall, refused to swear the oath acknowledging Henry's supremacy. He was imprisoned in the Tower and, in July 1535, beheaded. John Fisher, the elderly Bishop of Rochester, met the same fate. Across England, those who clung to the old faith faced a terrible choice: conform or suffer. Most conformed. The machinery of the state was overwhelming, and the rewards of compliance were substantial. But some refused, and they paid with their lives. The monasteries fell next. England's religious houses controlled enormous wealth: land, gold, art, libraries accumulated over centuries. Cromwell's agents visited them in the guise of reformers, cataloguing abuses real and imagined, compiling evidence to justify dissolution. Between 1536 and 1540, some 800 monasteries, priories, convents, and friaries were suppressed. Their inhabitants were pensioned off or dispersed. Their treasures were seized. Their lands were sold to nobles and gentry, who thereby acquired a powerful financial stake in the Reformation's permanence. Medieval England, with its rhythms of monastic bells and its calendar of saints' days, was being dismantled stone by stone. In the north, resistance flared into rebellion. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 was the largest popular uprising of the Tudor era. 30,000 men marched under banners of the Five Wounds of Christ, demanding the restoration of the monasteries and the dismissal of Cromwell. For a moment, the regime seemed to totter, but Henry played for time, made promises he never intended to keep, and waited for the movement to fragment. When it did, the reprisals were savage. 200 rebels were executed. The northern nobility learned that defiance was fatal. And what of Anne, the woman for whom this revolution had been launched? She gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, born in September 1533, but not the son he craved. Another pregnancy ended in miscarriage. The king's eye began to wander toward Jane Seymour, a quiet, pale young woman whose meekness was everything Anne's fire was not. In May 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, charges almost certainly fabricated. She was tried, condemned, and beheaded at the Tower of London on May 19th. She was perhaps 35 years old. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. In October 1537, she gave him what he had wanted for so long: a son, Edward, healthy and strong. But Jane did not survive the birth. She died 12 days after Edward's arrival, and Henry, whatever his faults, appears to have mourned her genuinely. When he died a decade later, he asked to be buried beside her. The years that followed were restless, erratic. Henry married 3 more times. Anne of Cleves, a diplomatic union that he found personally repulsive and quickly annulled. Catherine Howard, a young cousin of Anne Boleyn, executed in 1542 for alleged adultery. And Catherine Parr, a sensible widow who survived him. His health deteriorated. The athletic prince became a bloated invalid, his leg afflicted by ulcers that would not heal. His temper, never mild, became dangerous. Men who had served him faithfully for decades found themselves suddenly accused of treason and dispatched to the block. Yet the machinery of government kept turning. Cromwell, executed in 1540 in one of Henry's sudden reversals, had built administrative structures that would outlast him. The Privy Council functioned, the courts of law continued. England was being transformed from a medieval kingdom into a modern state, and even the king's erratic interventions could not entirely derail that process. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, he left behind a realm that would have been unrecognisable to his father. The break with Rome was complete. The monasteries were gone. The English Bible, translated by Tyndale, polished by Coverdale, authorised by Henry himself, could be read in every parish church. The nobility had been reshaped by the redistribution of monastic lands, and 3 children survived to fight over his legacy. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, steadfast in her Catholic faith; Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose religious convictions remained carefully opaque; and Edward, son of Jane Seymour, 9 years old and king. The boy king's reign was brief but consequential. Edward VI was intelligent, precocious, and genuinely committed to the Protestant cause. His regents, first the Duke of Somerset, then the Duke of Northumberland, pushed the Reformation further than Henry had ever intended. The Mass was abolished. Priests were allowed to marry. Images and altars were stripped from churches. The first Book of Common Prayer, largely the work of Thomas Cranmer, established a liturgy in English that remains the foundation of Anglican worship today. But Edward was never strong. By 1552 it was clear that he was dying of tuberculosis, and that raised a terrifying question: who would succeed him? By the terms of Henry's will, the next in line was Mary, Catholic Mary, who would surely undo everything the reformers had accomplished. Northumberland hatched a desperate scheme to alter the succession, placing Lady Jane Grey, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII and a convinced Protestant, on the throne. Edward, on his deathbed, was persuaded to sign the documents excluding his sisters. It failed. When Edward died in July 1553, Jane was proclaimed Queen, but almost no one supported her. Mary rode toward London with a growing army, and within 9 days Northumberland's coalition collapsed. Jane Grey, only 16, was imprisoned in the tower she had briefly ruled, and Mary entered her capital in triumph, determined to restore everything that had been taken from her: her faith, her legitimacy, and the true religion of England. The bells of London rang for Mary Tudor as they had rung for no monarch in living memory. The people thronged the streets, weeping with joy, throwing flowers before her horse, crying out blessings upon the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the princess who had been wronged, the queen who had come into her own at last. She was 37 years old, small and slight, her face already lined by years of anxiety, humiliation, and stubborn endurance. But on that August day in 1553, none of that mattered. She had won. Against all odds, against the scheming of powerful men, against the machinery of state arrayed against her, she had claimed her birthright. The people had chosen her, and she believed with all her heart that God had chosen her too. Mary's first months as queen were marked by a surprising clemency. Northumberland was executed, as everyone expected, but many of his co-conspirators were spared. Even Lady Jane Grey, the puppet queen, was allowed to live, at least for now, a prisoner in the Tower but not yet condemned to die. Mary seemed to understand that she needed to heal the wounds of faction, to present herself as a merciful sovereign who would bring peace after the turbulent years of her brother's minority. She released Catholic bishops who had been imprisoned under Edward. She heard Mass openly, glorying in the rituals that had been forbidden, and she began, carefully but purposefully, to dismantle the Protestant settlement that had transformed England. But mercy had its limits, and Mary's patience was not infinite. In January 1554, a rebellion broke out in Kent, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, ostensibly in protest against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, but drawing much of its energy from Protestant fears of what a Catholic restoration would mean. Wyatt marched on London with several thousand men, and for a few terrifying days the capital seemed ready to fall. Mary, however, refused to flee. She rode to the Guildhall and addressed the citizens directly, her voice steady, her words fierce with conviction. She was their queen, she told them, wedded to her realm. She would not abandon them, and London held. Wyatt was captured, tortured, and executed. His rebellion was crushed, but it had consequences. Lady Jane Grey, who had been a pawn in other men's games and posed no threat while she lived quietly in the Tower, now became a symbol around whom future rebels might rally. Mary, with visible reluctance signed her death warrant. On February 12, 1554, Jane Grey walked to the scaffold on Tower Green. She was 16 years old. Contemporary accounts describe her composure, her Protestant faith unwavering to the end. She asked the executioner to dispatch her quickly, then blindfolded herself and groped for the block, momentarily lost and frightened, a girl after all. The axe fell, and England's 9-day queen was gone. The marriage to Philip went forward that July in Winchester Cathedral, amid splendour designed to overawe any lingering doubts. Philip was 27, handsome in a cold Habsburg way, heir to the vast dominions of his father Charles V, Spain, the Netherlands, much of Italy, the treasures of the New World. Mary adored him from the moment she saw him. Philip, for his part, found his bride plain, ageing, and politically useful. He performed his duties as a husband with the same methodical attention he brought to matters of state, and then, as soon as decently possible, he left England for his continental possessions. He would return only when he needed something. Mary believed she was pregnant. The court celebrated. England waited for an heir who would secure the Catholic succession and end the spectre of Elizabeth, Protestant Elizabeth, daughter of the hated Anne Boleyn, taking the throne. But the months passed, and no child came. Mary's belly swelled, but it was not a baby. It was likely a phantom pregnancy, perhaps caused by uterine disease, perhaps by the desperate intensity of her longing. By August 1555, she had to accept the humiliating truth. There would be no child. Philip, who had waited for an heir to bind England to his interests, departed for the Netherlands. Mary was left alone, aging, ill, and increasingly bitter, to pursue the one cause that still gave her life meaning, the restoration of the true faith. The burnings began in February 1555 and continued for nearly 4 years. Under Mary and her bishops, particularly Edmund Bonner of London and the returned Cardinal Reginald Pole, now Archbishop of Canterbury, England witnessed a campaign of religious persecution unprecedented in its intensity. The heresy laws that Henry VIII had used sparingly, that Edward's Protestant regime had largely ignored, were now enforced with systematic rigour. Nearly 300 people were burned at the stake for their Protestant beliefs. Among them were bishops, including Thomas Cranmer, architect of the English Reformation, whose famous recantations were followed by a final, defiant withdrawal of everything he had said under pressure. There were common men and women, weavers, tailors, servants, housewives, who went to the flames rather than deny what they believed. There were young people and old people, people who might have escaped if they had fled, people who seemed almost to seek martyrdom. John Foxe, a Protestant exile, began collecting their stories. His Book of Martyrs, published after Mary's death, would become one of the most influential books in English history, shaping Protestant identity for centuries. Foxe portrayed Mary as Bloody Mary, a tyrant drunk on the suffering of innocents, and his portraits of the martyrs, standing firm in the flames, crying out scripture, forgiving their persecutors, became foundational myths of English Protestantism. The historical reality was more complicated. Mary genuinely believed she was saving souls, that a brief agony in this world was nothing compared to eternal damnation. Her bishops believed the same. From their perspective, they were doctors performing painful but necessary surgery on a diseased body politic. But the burnings horrified many who witnessed them. Even loyal Catholics began to murmur that this was not the way to win hearts, and the burnings did not work. They created martyrs rather than deterring heresy. They associated Catholicism in English minds with cruelty, with Spanish influence, with the fires of Smithfield. Every Protestant who died singing hymns, every grandmother who refused to recant, every boy apprentice who chose the stake over the Mass, became a witness against Mary's church. The persecution achieved the opposite of what it intended. It did not extinguish Protestantism in England. It made Protestantism English, native, heroic. It planted seeds of anti-Catholic sentiment that would take centuries to fade. Meanwhile, Mary's health declined. She suffered from headaches, from insomnia, from a persistent abdominal swelling that some have diagnosed as ovarian cancer or uterine fibroids. She clung to hope of another pregnancy even as her body failed her. She yearned for Philip, who stayed away, who wrote infrequently, who was busy with his wars against France. When he did return briefly in 1557, it was to drag England into that conflict, a war that brought England nothing but the loss of Calais, the last English possession in France held for over 200 years. "When I am dead," Mary reportedly said, "you will find Calais lying in my heart." It was a defeat that seemed to embody everything that had gone wrong. The Spanish marriage, the foreign entanglements, the sense that England had become a pawn in games played by greater powers. Mary died on November 17, 1558, at St James's Palace during Mass, as she would have wished. She was 42 years old. Her reign had lasted just over 5 years, and much of what she had worked for would be undone within months. But she had not been entirely a failure. She had proven that a woman could rule England in her own right, could command armies, could make policy, could be addressed as Queen Regnant rather than as Queen Consort. She had reformed the coinage, reorganised the navy, improved the efficiency of royal administration. She had loved her country, in her way, even as she failed to understand it, and she had held the throne long enough to ensure that when she died there was only one viable successor, the sister she had grown to hate. Elizabeth learned of Mary's death at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, where she had lived in a state of anxious semi-captivity for years. She had survived Mary's reign through a combination of luck, intelligence, and calculated ambiguity. When Wyatt's rebellion broke out, Mary had her brought to the Tower, convinced that Elizabeth was involved. For 2 months, Elizabeth lived in the shadow of the scaffold, never knowing if each day would be her last. But no evidence could be found. She was released to house arrest, watched constantly, suspected always, but alive. She attended Mass when required, kept her own counsel and waited. Now, at 25, she was Queen of England. The accession was smooth, almost anticlimactic after the drama of Mary's succession 5 years earlier. Elizabeth rode into London to cheering crowds, and if the cheers seemed more relieved than ecstatic, relief that the burnings would stop, that the Spanish alliance would end, that there would be no more phantom pregnancies and no more desperate clinging to a dying cause. Elizabeth did not seem to notice or mind. She had learned long ago not to trust popular adulation. She had seen how quickly the crowd could turn. She would spend her reign managing, manipulating and performing for audiences she never entirely believed in. Her first task was the religious settlement. England had lurched from Henry's idiosyncratic Catholicism to Edward's strident Protestantism to Mary's fierce restoration of Rome, and each change had brought persecution, exile and death. Elizabeth wanted no more of it. She was a Protestant by upbringing and conviction, but she was not a zealot. "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls," she would later say, and while the phrase may be apocryphal, it captured something true about her approach. She wanted conformity in outward practice. What people believed in their hearts was, within limits, their own affair. The Elizabethan settlement, enacted by Parliament in 1559, established a middle way. The monarch was supreme governor of the Church of England, not supreme head, a slightly softer title designed to ease consciences troubled by a woman claiming headship over Christ's church. The Book of Common Prayer was restored, though in a version that carefully hedged on the most controversial doctrines. The language of the communion service, for instance, could be read as either affirming or denying the real presence of Christ in the bread and wine. Catholics could attend services without feeling they had committed apostasy. Protestants could find in the same words a proper Reformed theology. It was a fudge, a compromise, a typically English solution that satisfied no one completely and kept the peace for 50 years. Not everyone was satisfied, of course. Catholics who remained loyal to Rome faced increasing penalties as the reign progressed, particularly after papal excommunication of Elizabeth in 1570 made all Catholics potential traitors in the eyes of the state. Seminary priests trained on the continent and smuggled back into England to sustain the old faith were hunted, captured and executed. Jesuits like Edmund Campion became martyrs for their cause, and Catholic recusants, those who refused to attend Anglican services, paid heavy fines and faced social exclusion. From the other direction, Puritans, Protestants who felt the settlement had not gone far enough, that England was still half Catholic in its ceremonies and governance, pressed for further reform. Elizabeth resisted them with the same stubbornness she showed Rome. She liked her church as it was. She had no intention of stripping away the vestments, the music, the beauty that made worship dignified. The Puritans would have to wait for another reign, another century. But religion, however important, was not Elizabeth's only concern. The great question of her reign, the question that obsessed her councillors and terrified her parliament, was the question of marriage and succession. She was the last of Henry's children. She had no heir. If she died without issue, England would face a succession crisis that could tear the realm apart. There were candidates: Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, Catholic and troublesome, various English nobles with thinner claims, perhaps even Philip of Spain, who had briefly married Mary Tudor and still harboured ambitions. Parliament begged Elizabeth to marry. Suitors arrived from across Europe, offering alliances and heirs. Elizabeth entertained them all and married none. She used her unmarried state as a diplomatic tool, dangling the possibility of her hand before one prince after another, extracting concessions and buying time. The courtship with the Duke of Anjou dragged on for years, the subject of poems, masques and diplomatic dispatches. Elizabeth called him her frog and seemed genuinely fond of him, but she could never quite bring herself to close the deal. Whether she truly intended to marry, whether she could not bring herself to share power with a husband, whether some deep psychological wound from her childhood made her fear marriage itself. Biographers have debated these questions for centuries without resolution. What is clear is that she died as she had lived, the Virgin Queen, wedded to England, mother to her people, alone. Meanwhile, Mary Stuart presented a constant danger. She had been Queen of Scotland since she was 6 days old, raised in France as the bride of the Dauphin, briefly Queen Consort of France before her husband's death, sent her back to Scotland as a young widow. She was Catholic, charming, romantic, and spectacularly unsuited to govern a kingdom torn by religious faction and aristocratic violence. Her second marriage to her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was a disaster. Darnley was handsome, vain, jealous, and possibly syphilitic. He helped murder Mary's secretary David Rizzio before her eyes, and was himself murdered shortly after, blown up in his house at Bosworth Field in circumstances that pointed directly to Mary's new favourite, the Earl of Bothwell. 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary married Bothwell, a marriage that scandalised Europe and turned even her supporters against her. The Scottish lords rose in rebellion. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son James, and escaped only to find herself a fugitive with nowhere to go but south. She crossed into England in 1568, throwing herself on Elizabeth's mercy. It was the worst decision of her life. Elizabeth could not send her back to Scotland, where she would certainly be killed. She could not send her to France or Spain, where she would become a rallying point for Catholic powers eager to depose Elizabeth. She could not let her go free in England, where she would attract every disaffected Catholic and ambitious noble in the realm. So Mary remained a prisoner, a comfortable prisoner, housed in the various castles and manor houses, allowed her servants and her embroidery and her little dogs, but a prisoner nonetheless, for 19 years. Those 19 years were punctuated by plots. The Ridolfi plot in 1571, the Throckmorton plot in 1583, the Babington plot in 1586, each aimed at assassinating Elizabeth, freeing Mary and restoring Catholicism to England. Elizabeth's spy master, Francis Walsingham, built an intelligence network that infiltrated these conspiracies, decoded their ciphers, and brought their participants to the scaffold. After Babington, there could be no more pretense. Mary had been caught in explicit correspondence authorising Elizabeth's murder. The evidence was presented to a commission of nobles and judges who found her guilty of treason. Parliament clamoured for her execution. Elizabeth hesitated. She had always been reluctant to shed blood, particularly royal blood. To execute an anointed queen, even one who had conspired at her death, set a precedent that made her own neck feel vulnerable. She signed the death warrant, then tried to arrange for Mary's death by less official means. When her secretary sent the warrant to Fotheringhay Castle without waiting for her explicit command, Elizabeth was furious, or pretended to be. Mary was beheaded on February 8, 1587, dressed in the red of martyrdom, forgiving her executioners, dying with a dignity she had rarely shown in life. The little dog hidden beneath her skirts crept out and would not leave her body. Elizabeth wept and raged and punished her secretary, but the deed was done. Catholic Europe was outraged. Philip of Spain, who had been planning an invasion even before Mary's death, accelerated his preparations. The Great Crusade against heretical England would proceed. By 1588, the Armada was ready. 130 ships, 30,000 men, the mightiest fleet ever assembled. It would sail to the Netherlands, collect the Duke of Parma's army of veterans, and ferry them across the Channel to crush Elizabeth once and for all. The summer of 1588 became legend. English ships, smaller and more manoeuvrable than the great Spanish galleons, harassed the Armada as it made its slow progress up the Channel. Fireships scattered the fleet at Calais. Storms completed what English cannon had begun. The Armada was broken, driven north around Scotland and wrecked on the coasts of Ireland. Thousands of Spaniards drowned or were killed by Irish chieftains when they struggled ashore. Of the great fleet that had set sail from Lisbon, barely half limped home. Elizabeth rode to Tilbury, where her army waited to repel the invasion that never came. She wore a silver breastplate over a white velvet gown, mounted on a grey gelding, looking every inch the warrior queen. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she told her troops, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." It was perhaps the greatest performance of her reign, and she had always been a performer. The Armada's defeat was not the end of the war with Spain. That would drag on for another 16 years. But it was the moment when England emerged as a Protestant power that could stand against the mightiest empire in the world. It was the moment when the little kingdom on the edge of Europe announced that it would not be conquered, converted, or crushed. The years after the Armada were a golden age, or so they would come to seem in retrospect. Shakespeare was writing. Marlowe and Spencer and Sidney were transforming English literature. Drake and Hawkins and Raleigh were plundering Spanish treasure ships and establishing the first tentative English presence in the New World. The court was brilliant, extravagant, a stage for the elaborate cult of Gloriana, the ageless virgin queen whom poets celebrated in verses drenched with classical allusion. Elizabeth presided over it all, accepting the worship, demanding the flattery, playing the role she had created for herself. But she was growing old, and the realm grew restless with her. The favourites of her later years, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, handsome and hot-tempered, could not fill the space left by Leicester, who had died shortly after the Armada. Essex pushed her too far, challenged her authority, raised a pathetic rebellion in London that collapsed within hours. She sent him to the block in 1601, and something in her seemed to die with him. The Essex affair showed the dark side of the Elizabethan cult. An aging queen who could not tolerate dissent, who demanded adoration even as her face grew gaunt and her red wigs fooled no one, who had outlived most of her generation and could not bring herself to name a successor. In her final years, she became silent on the succession question, as if naming James of Scotland, Mary Stuart's son, the obvious choice, would somehow hasten her own death. But everyone knew. James waited in Edinburgh with studied patience. When Elizabeth finally died, on March 24, 1603, her counsellors rode north with the news almost before her body was cold. The hooves thundered through the night, relays of riders carrying the news that would transform two kingdoms into one. Robert Carey, Elizabeth's cousin, had slipped away from Richmond Palace even before the official announcement, racing 400 miles in 60 hours, arriving in Edinburgh battered, bloodied from a fall, but triumphant. He knelt before James VI of Scotland and hailed him as James I of England. The waiting was over. James descended on his new inheritance with the eagerness of a man who had been promised a fortune and finally come to collect it. Scotland had been poor, fractious, its nobles turbulent, its kirk demanding. England was rich beyond his imagining, its coffers deep, its court magnificent, its monarch's power seemingly absolute. He had been King of Scotland since he was 13 months old, had survived kidnappings and assassination attempts, and the relentless interference of Presbyterian ministers who believed they had the right to lecture him on his duties. Now he was king of the greatest realm in Christendom, or so he believed, having never troubled himself much with geography or the pretensions of France. He was 36 years old, already set in his ways, convinced of his own wisdom, determined to rule as he saw fit. The English were not entirely sure what to make of him. He was learned, certainly, perhaps the most learned monarch ever to sit on their throne, but his learning was of a peculiar kind, running to theology and demonology and the theory of divine right. He had written books, one on the divine authority of kings, another on the evils of tobacco, a third on how to detect and prosecute witches. He spoke with a thick Scottish accent that courtiers struggled to understand, slobbered when he ate because his tongue was too large for his mouth, and had a wandering eye that made it unclear whom he was addressing. His legs were weak, forcing him to lean on his favourites when he walked. He was terrified of naked steel and had his doublets padded against assassination. He hunted obsessively, spending weeks in the saddle while his ministers waited for decisions. He was generous to a fault with those he loved, showering them with titles and estates and monopolies that drained the treasury Elizabeth had so carefully filled. But he brought something England desperately needed: an heir. 2 heirs, in fact. Henry, Prince of Wales, a golden boy of promise, and Charles, Duke of York, smaller and shyer, but undeniably male. After 45 years of uncertainty, after the endless speculation about who would succeed the Virgin Queen, there was suddenly a royal family again, a dynasty stretching into the future. The relief was palpable. Whatever James's faults, and they were many, he represented continuity. The wars of succession that had haunted England for over a century seemed finally, definitively over. The transition was remarkably smooth. Elizabeth's counsellors simply became James's counsellors. Robert Cecil, the hunchbacked spymaster who had managed Elizabeth's final years, managed James's first with equal skill. The machinery of government hummed along as if nothing had changed. There were celebrations, of course, a coronation, processions, the distribution of honours to those who had backed the right horse. But there was no purge, no revolution, no settling of scores. The Tudor apparatus of state continued to function, now in Stuart hands. Yet beneath the surface calm, tensions were already building that would consume the century to come. James believed in the divine right of kings with a fervour that Elizabeth, for all her majesty, had never quite expressed. She had worked with Parliament, cajoled it, occasionally bullied it, but always recognised that she needed it, for money, for legitimacy, for the laws that governed her realm. James saw Parliament as a nuisance, a collection of presumptuous commoners who had no business questioning their sovereign. Kings are justly called gods, he told Parliament in 1610, for they exercise a manner of resemblance of divine power upon earth. The Commons listened in uneasy silence. This was not what they were accustomed to hearing. The religious settlement that Elizabeth had crafted with such care also began to fray. James had been raised Presbyterian, but he had no love for the Kirk and its endless interference in royal affairs. No bishop, no king, he famously declared, recognising that the hierarchy of the Church supported the hierarchy of the state. He threw in his lot with the Church of England, defending its episcopal structure against Puritan demands for further reform. The Puritans had hoped that a Scottish king would be sympathetic to their cause, would strip away the popish remnants that still clung to the English Church, the vestments, the ceremonies, the bishops. They were bitterly disappointed. James made clear that he would tolerate no Presbyterian experiments in England. The Puritans would have to wait, or leave. Some chose to leave eventually for the wilderness of New England, carrying with them a deep suspicion of royal authority that would echo down the centuries. The Catholics fared even worse. They too had hoped for toleration, knowing that James's mother had died a Catholic martyr, and that James himself had been making quiet overtures to Catholic powers. But the political reality was stark. England's identity was now bound up with its Protestantism, and any king who showed too much favour to Rome risked alienating the very people he needed to support him. James enforced the recusancy laws, fining Catholics who refused to attend Anglican services, though he stopped short of the active persecution that had marked Elizabeth's later years. For some Catholics, this was not enough. In November 1605, a group of conspirators planned to blow up Parliament while James and his lords sat within, igniting a Catholic uprising that would place his daughter Elizabeth on the throne under a Catholic regency. The gunpowder plot, as it came to be known, was discovered mere hours before the fuse was to be lit. Guy Fawkes was found in the cellars beneath Westminster, surrounded by 36 barrels of gunpowder, ready to strike the spark that would have changed everything. The discovery of the plot confirmed every Protestant fear about Catholic treachery. Fawkes and his fellow conspirators were tortured, tried and executed with the full brutality that treason demanded. Their bodies were hung, drawn and quartered, their heads displayed on spikes as a warning to others. Parliament instituted November 5th as a day of thanksgiving, a celebration of the King's deliverance that would be marked with bonfires and fireworks and the burning of effigies for centuries to come. The plot achieved the opposite of what its authors intended. Instead of liberating English Catholics, it damned them to generations of suspicion and exclusion. To be Catholic was now to be potentially traitorous, a fifth column waiting for the chance to murder Protestant monarchs and restore the rule of Rome. James survived, but his reign was already showing signs of the conflicts that would tear his sons apart. Parliament grew increasingly restive about money, about monopolies, about the king's extravagant favourites. James had expensive tastes and little understanding of finance. Elizabeth had left a treasury that was not rich but at least solvent. James spent freely, heaping gifts on his Scottish friends who had followed him south, creating new titles to sell for ready cash, running up debts that his ministers struggled to cover. The Commons, which controlled the purse strings, began to use that control as leverage, demanding concessions in exchange for grants. James was outraged by what he saw as presumption. He dissolved parliaments when they grew too troublesome, ruling for long stretches without them, raising money through feudal dues and forced loans that skirted the edge of legality. It worked, more or less, because James never faced the kind of crisis that would force him to summon Parliament whether he wanted to or not. But the pattern was set: a king who believed his authority came from God, and a Parliament that believed its ancient rights must be respected. The collision was only postponed. Prince Henry, the great hope of the realm, died in 1612, aged 18, probably of typhoid fever. The grief was immense. Henry had been everything his father was not: athletic, martial, Protestant with a fervour that pleased the Puritans, eager to lead English armies against the Catholic powers of Europe. He was to have been England's warrior king, the champion of international Protestantism, the scourge of Spain. His death left the succession in the hands of Charles, who was 12 years old and already showing signs of the rigidity and obstinacy that would destroy him. England mourned a future that would never be. James turned increasingly to his favourites in his later years, seeking in younger men the companionship and admiration that politics could not provide. Robert Carr, a handsome Scot, rose to become Earl of Somerset and wielded enormous influence until he was implicated in the murder of Sir Thomas Overbury and fell from grace in scandal. George Villiers, even more beautiful, replaced him, rising with dizzying speed from obscure gentleman to Earl, then Marquess, then Duke of Buckingham, the first non-royal duke in a century. James loved him without disguise, calling him his sweet child and wife, showering him with power and riches, defending him against all criticism. Buckingham was charming, ambitious, and spectacularly incompetent at the foreign policy he increasingly controlled. His bungled negotiations for a Spanish marriage for Prince Charles, his disastrous expedition to relieve the French Protestants at La Rochelle. These failures would come later, but they were rooted in the power James gave him, power that should have been wielded by men who knew what they were doing. The king grew old, and his health failed, and the conflicts he had managed to contain through a combination of political skill and good fortune began to strain against their bonds. He had kept England at peace in a Europe racked by religious war, the 30 Years' War that was consuming Germany and drawing in every major power. He had avoided the great confrontation with Parliament that his financial needs seemed to demand. He had maintained the religious settlement, neither satisfying the Puritans nor provoking the Catholics into further plots. But these were achievements of avoidance, of postponement, of kicking the great questions down the road for his successor to answer. When James died in March 1625, aged 58, exhausted by illness and old before his time, he left behind a kingdom that was prosperous, at peace, and fundamentally unstable. The divine right absolutism he had preached, the parliamentary assertiveness he had provoked, the religious divisions he had papered over, all of these would explode within 2 decades, in a civil war that would kill more Englishmen proportionally than any conflict until the Somme. But we have run ahead of ourselves, as historians are wont to do when they know what is coming. Let us step back to the years of peace, the years when England believed itself blessed, when the darkness of civil war was unimaginable, and the reign of James seemed, for all its irritations, a golden age continuing the glory of Elizabeth. London was growing, swelling beyond its medieval walls into the suburbs that would one day swallow them entirely. The population had doubled since Henry V's time, perhaps tripled, crowding into narrow streets where open sewers ran, and the plague visited every few years to cull the excess. The great houses along the Strand connected the city to Westminster, their gardens running down to the river where wherries plied for hire and great barges carried the nobility from palace to palace. The theatres, the Globe, the Rose, the Fortune, had moved south of the river to Southwark, beyond the jurisdiction of the city fathers who disapproved of such entertainments. There, amid the bear-baiting rings and the brothels, Shakespeare and his successors staged the dramas that would define English literature, plays performed in the open air to audiences of groundlings and gallants, the stink of the crowd mingling with the thunder of blank verse. It was an age of expansion, of restless energy seeking outlets. The Virginia Company had established Jamestown in 1607, the first permanent English settlement in North America, though permanent was a relative term for a colony that nearly starved out of existence and would struggle for decades before tobacco made it profitable. The Pilgrims sailed in 1620, seeking in the wilderness of Massachusetts the religious freedom they could not find at home. The East India Company was building its network of trading posts in Asia, laying the foundations of an empire that would one day dwarf anything the Tudors could have imagined. English ships were everywhere, in the Caribbean, off the coast of Africa, probing the frozen waters north of Canada in search of a northwest passage to the riches of the Orient. The world was opening up, and England was determined not to be left behind. At home, the gentry prospered. The great wool trade that had made England rich continued to flourish, though cloth exports were beginning to face competition from continental manufacturers. The dissolution of the monasteries, that great transfer of wealth that Henry VIII had engineered 80 years before, had created a new class of landowners, families that had bought abbey lands and built manor houses from the rubble of medieval piety. These were the men who sat in Parliament, who served as justices of the peace, who administered the counties in the king's name while jealously guarding their own privileges. They were literate, many of them educated at Oxford or Cambridge, or the Inns of Court, readers of classical histories from which they drew uncomfortable parallels to their own times. They were developing a sense of themselves as the natural rulers of England, partners with the monarch rather than merely subjects of his will. This was the class that would resist the Stuart kings, that would raise armies and vote death sentences and proclaim republics. But in James's time, they were still loyal, still willing to work within the system even as they chafed against its restrictions. Religion permeated everything. The Sabbath was enforced with fines for those who missed church. The Bible, now available in the magnificent translation that James had commissioned, the King James Version that would shape the English language for 4 centuries, was read in every household that could afford a copy. Sermons lasted hours, their doctrinal subtleties debated afterward with a fervour that seems alien to a secular age. The Calvinist theology that had come to dominate English Protestantism taught that God had predestined some souls to salvation and others to damnation, that nothing one did could change one's eternal fate, that the elect were chosen before the foundations of the world. This bleak doctrine produced not despair, but urgent introspection, as the godly searched their hearts for signs that they were among the saved and expressed their gratitude for election through lives of rigorous moral discipline. The ungodly were not merely unfortunate, they were the damned, and treating with them risked contamination. This mindset, fierce, certain, intolerant of compromise, would fuel the revolutionary fires to come. But revolution was not yet on the horizon as James's reign wound to its close. The king was sick, his body failing, but the succession was secure. Charles was married now to Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess whose faith would cause endless trouble, but who would bear him children enough to continue the line? Buckingham was at the height of his power, dominating the dying king and the young prince alike, already making the enemies that would lead to his assassination. Parliament had been dissolved again after yet another quarrel over money and precedent, but surely it would return when the new king needed funds. These crises were containable, these tensions manageable, or so it seemed. James died as he had lived, verbosely and with great theological confidence. He had been a successful king by most measures. He had kept the peace, maintained his throne, fathered heirs, presided over a flourishing of culture and commerce. His reign was not heroic, but it was competent, and competence is rarer in kings than we might suppose. He was succeeded by a son who had neither his intelligence nor his flexibility, who believed as fervently in divine right but lacked the political instincts to make that belief work in practice. Charles I ascended the throne in March 1625, 24 years old, handsome in a melancholy way, determined to rule as his father had ruled, by the grace of God and without interference from presumptuous subjects. He would rule for 24 years, and at the end of them, on a cold January morning in 1649, he would step through a window of the banqueting house in Whitehall, the same hall where he had presided over masques and feasts, and lay his head on the block before a crowd that did not cheer. But that story belongs to another telling. The Tudor dynasty, which had begun in blood at Bosworth, ended in bed at Richmond, an old woman dying alone while her courtiers whispered in the corridors, and her cousin rode north with the news. It had lasted 118 years, 5 monarchs, and transformed England beyond recognition. The medieval kingdom that Henry VII had inherited, Catholic, feudal, peripheral to European affairs, had become something new. Protestant, centralised, assertive, its monarch head of church and state combined, its parliament increasingly conscious of its own importance, its merchants and adventurers spreading across the globe. The religious revolution that Henry VIII began in pursuit of an heir had swept away 1,000 years of Catholic Christianity and replaced it with something that was still being defined, still being fought over, still capable of inspiring martyrs and murderers alike. The 6 marriages of Henry VIII had produced 3 children who ruled and none who left heirs of their body. Edward's Protestant zeal had burned too bright and died too young. Mary's Catholic restoration had burned too many and achieved too little. Elizabeth had made her virginity a political weapon, using the prospect of marriage to keep suitors and rivals dancing for 40 years, but in the end the Virgin Queen meant a virgin dynasty, a line that ended with her last breath, and yet what she had built did not die with her. The England of 1603 was unrecognisable from the England of 1485, and that transformation, wrought through blood and policy, through accident and design, through the terrifying gambles of monarchs and the quiet endurance of common people, that transformation endured. To understand its full scope, we must return now to those first uncertain years, when the crown sat so precariously on Tudor heads that every whisper seemed a conspiracy and every pretender a mortal threat. Henry VII had won his kingdom on a battlefield, but battlefields are easier than boardrooms, and the slow work of making his dynasty legitimate proved harder than the quick work of killing Richard III. He was not a charismatic king. He did not inspire love or awe. His portraits show us a man of narrow face and calculating eyes, thin-lipped, watchful, the face of a merchant rather than a warrior. And in many ways that is precisely what he was. Where other kings spent treasure on glory, Henry counted it. Where others trusted their nobles with armies and power, Henry trusted ledgers and informants. He was the most modern of medieval kings, which is to say he understood that power rested not on chivalric display, but on the hard currency of gold and the harder currency of information. His marriage to Elizabeth of York was a masterstroke of political calculation disguised as romance. She was the daughter of Edward IV, the Yorkist princess whose blood could heal the wounds of 30 years of civil war. Their union merged the white rose and the red. Lancaster and York combined in a new symbol that Henry displayed obsessively. The Tudor rose, red petals surrounding white, a botanical impossibility that became the emblem of an improbable peace. Elizabeth herself remains a shadowy figure in the histories, overshadowed by her husband's political manoeuvring and her son's monstrous appetites. But she bore her role with dignity, producing the heirs that the dynasty required, including a second son named Henry, who was never meant to be king and who would become the most famous king in English history. The early years of Henry VII's reign were haunted by pretenders, those ghost princes who emerged from the margins of Europe claiming to be one or another of the vanished Yorkist heirs. Lambert Simnel was the first, a boy of obscure origin, who was coached to impersonate the Earl of Warwick, the nephew of Edward IV who had the strongest Yorkist claim to the throne. The real Warwick was a prisoner in the Tower, where Henry VII had confined him immediately upon taking the crown, an acknowledgement of how dangerous that blood claim remained. Simnel's rebellion ended at the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487, the last true battle of the Wars of the Roses, though we did not know it then. The boy himself was captured, and Henry, in a gesture that mixed mercy with contempt, put him to work in the royal kitchens. A pretender to the throne of England ended his days turning spits and carrying platters, a living reminder that Henry VII's justice could be cruel even when it spared the headsman's axe. Perkin Warbeck was a more dangerous ghost. He appeared in 1491, a young man of remarkable presence who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who had disappeared into the Tower during Richard III's reign, and whose fate remained one of the great mysteries of the age. Had they been murdered? Had one escaped? The uncertainty that protected the Tudor dynasty from certain accusations also made it vulnerable to precisely this kind of imposture. Warbeck wandered the courts of Europe for years, received as a prince by Margaret of Burgundy, Edward IV's sister who never accepted the Tudor usurpation, entertained by the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, welcomed by James V of Scotland, who married him to a noblewoman and launched an invasion of England on his behalf. Henry VII spent enormous sums on spies and diplomats, tracking Warbeck's movements, undermining his support, waiting for the moment when this wandering ghost would finally make a mistake. That moment came in 1497, when Warbeck landed in Cornwall to support a local rebellion against Henry's taxes. The Cornishmen had risen in fury at the levies Henry demanded to fund his wars in the north, and they marched on London with a peasant army that frightened the court badly before being crushed at Blackheath. Warbeck attached himself to the remnants of this movement, but he had no talent for military leadership, and his support melted away as Henry's forces approached. He was captured, confessed his imposture, and was eventually executed in 1499, along with the real Earl of Warwick, the genuine Yorkist heir whose continued existence made all such pretenders possible. Henry had kept Warwick alive for 14 years, a prisoner since childhood, an innocent whose only crime was his blood. Now that blood was spilled on Tower Green, and with it died the last plausible male Yorkist claimant to the throne. This execution tells us something important about Henry VII. He was not needlessly cruel. He had spared Lambert Simnel after all, and he had kept Warwick alive for years when more ruthless kings would have killed him immediately. But when dynasty required death, Henry did not flinch. The Tudors would always have this quality, a capacity for calculated violence that coexisted with genuine learning and culture, an ability to sign death warrants in the morning and patronise poets in the afternoon. Henry VII established the template that his descendants would follow with varying degrees of enthusiasm. His granddaughter Elizabeth would execute her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, with the same cold necessity, the same political calculation overriding whatever personal qualms she may have felt. The financial revolution that Henry VII effected was less dramatic than his dynastic manoeuvring, but equally important. Medieval kings had been chronically short of money, dependent on Parliament to grant taxes, constantly borrowing from Italian bankers at ruinous rates, pawning their jewels to fund their wars. Henry changed this. He developed new sources of revenue that did not require parliamentary approval, feudal dues ruthlessly enforced, customs duties carefully collected, bonds and recognizances that kept his nobles in perpetual financial anxiety. He employed a network of agents, most notoriously Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, who squeezed every penny from every source, legal or questionable, and who became so hated that Henry VIII would sacrifice them to popular fury within months of taking the throne. The king's account books, which survive in remarkable detail, show us a monarch who personally audited his finances, initialing entries in his own hand, tracking the flow of pounds and shillings with the attention of a merchant prince. When Henry VII died in 1509, he left a treasury so full that his son could afford years of extravagant waste before the bills came due. This was his gift to the Tudor dynasty. Not glory, not love, but solvency. It was perhaps the most practical gift any king ever gave his heir. Henry VII also laid the foundations of Tudor foreign policy, though his methods were very different from the martial adventures his son would pursue. Where Henry VIII would seek glory through invasion and conquest, his father sought security through marriage alliances and careful diplomacy. He married his eldest son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs whose union had created modern Spain, and whose conquest of Granada had completed the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. This was the most glittering match in Europe, an alliance with the rising superpower of the age, and Henry negotiated it with the same attention to detail he brought to his account books. The dowry was substantial, the terms were precise, the wedding was magnificent, and then Arthur died. 6 months after his marriage, the Prince of Wales was dead of the sweating sickness, a mysterious epidemic that terrified Tudor England with its sudden onset and rapid mortality. Men who were healthy at breakfast could be dead by dinner. There was no understanding of its causes, no effective treatment, only terror and prayer. Arthur was 15 years old, and with him died his father's carefully constructed plans. But there was a spare heir, a second son who had been destined for the church, and Henry VII began immediately to negotiate a new arrangement. Catherine would marry the new Prince of Wales, her brother-in-law Henry, and the Spanish alliance would be preserved. This required a papal dispensation, since church law prohibited marriage to a brother's widow. The question of whether the first marriage had been consummated became suddenly crucial. If Arthur and Catherine had never truly been husband and wife, the impediment was lesser and the dispensation easier. Catherine swore until her dying day that she had gone to her second marriage a virgin, that Arthur had been too ill or too young to consummate their union. This oath would matter desperately 30 years later, when her second husband sought to annul their marriage on the grounds that it had never been valid at all. But in 1503, no one imagined such complications. The dispensation was granted, the betrothal was arranged, and then Henry VII began to delay, to reconsider, to wonder if perhaps a better match might be found for his remaining son. These hesitations reflected the shifting balance of European power. Spain was no longer the only rising state. France was recovering from its Italian disasters. The Holy Roman Empire was consolidating under Maximilian. A prince who had seemed invaluable in 1502 might be bargained away for better terms in 1505. Catherine spent years in a limbo of poverty and uncertainty, betrothed to a prince who was instructed to protest that the betrothal had been made without his consent, dependent on an allowance that was frequently unpaid, writing desperate letters to her father that went unanswered. She was a princess without a position, a bride without a wedding, and her humiliation would shape her character in ways that would matter when she finally became queen. Henry VII died in April 1509, and everything changed. The new king was 17 years old, tall and athletic where his father had been spare and careful, generous where his father had been frugal, eager for glory where his father had been content with security. He had been raised in luxury, educated in the new humanist learning, trained in all the accomplishments of a Renaissance prince. He could joust and hunt and compose music and debate theology and dance until dawn. He was, everyone agreed, the most promising prince in Europe, and England had not seen such a king since the great Edward III himself. One of his first acts was to marry Catherine of Aragon, finally ending her 7 years of waiting. He did this without consulting his council, without negotiating new terms, without the endless delays that had characterized his father's approach. He wanted her, and he was king, and kings took what they wanted. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout his reign. Desire followed by action, impatience with obstacles, fury at anyone who stood in his way. These qualities made him a thrilling monarch in his youth and a terrifying one in his age. The executions of Dudley and Empson followed quickly, popular sacrifices to atone for the financial oppressions of the previous reign. Henry VIII presented himself as a liberator, freeing England from the penny-pinching tyranny of his father's agents, restoring the generous kingship that subjects had a right to expect. It was good politics and good theatre, and it cost Henry nothing except the lives of two men who had no powerful friends left to protect them. Their deaths established another pattern. When things went wrong, there would always be someone else to blame, someone whose punishment would allow the king to appear merciful and just, while satisfying the public's demand for scapegoats. The young king's court was a whirlwind of pleasure and display. Tournaments and masques, hunts and feasts, music and poetry and theological disputation. Henry excelled at all of them, and demanded that his courtiers keep pace. He spent money with abandon, draining the treasury his father had so carefully filled, confident that more could always be found when it was needed. He went to war with France because that was what English kings did, what Henry V had done a century before, and he dreamed of conquering a kingdom that had been lost to French resurgence and English civil war. The Battle of the Spurs in 1513 gave him a taste of military glory, French cavalry fleeing before English guns, but it produced no lasting conquests and cost far more than it gained. Meanwhile, in the north, a more significant battle was being fought. James Thorpe of Scotland had invaded England while Henry was in France, honouring the old alliance between Scotland and France that had bedevilled English kings for centuries. At Flodden Field, the Earl of Surrey destroyed the Scottish army and killed the Scottish king, the last British monarch to die in battle against a foreign enemy. James's body was found beneath a heap of slain nobles, his kingdom shattered, his infant son now king under a regency that would be troubled by faction and foreign interference for decades. This was the victory that mattered, not the skirmish in France, but Henry was not there to claim it. He had sent his elderly general north while he pursued personal glory in the wrong direction. The early years also brought Thomas Wolsey to prominence, the butcher's son who rose to become Lord Chancellor, Cardinal and Papal Legate, the most powerful minister England had ever seen. Wolsey understood Henry perfectly, understood that the king wanted results without effort, glory without tedium, the appearance of command without the work of governing. He provided all of this, managing the kingdom's affairs with brilliant efficiency, while keeping Henry happy with a constant flow of entertainment and flattery. Hampton Court, Wolsey's magnificent palace on the Thames, became more splendid than any royal residence, a visible sign of the minister's wealth and taste that would eventually prove his undoing. No subject should outshine his king, and Wolsey's very competence became evidence of dangerous ambition. But these were good years, golden years, before the great matter of the king's marriage poisoned everything. Catherine bore child after child, but they died, stillborn, or living only hours, or surviving a few weeks before succumbing to the endless diseases that carried off Tudor infants. Only one lived, Mary, born in 1516, a healthy princess who proved that Catherine could bear viable children, but a girl, and everyone knew that girls could not rule. England had never had a ruling queen, and the one attempt, Matilda in the 12th century, had produced civil war and disaster. Henry needed a son, and Catherine seemed increasingly unable to provide one. The king's eye began to wander. He had always had mistresses. This was expected of kings, and Catherine tolerated it with Spanish dignity, knowing that her position was secure as long as she remained queen. But in 1526 or thereabouts, Henry's wandering eye fixed on Anne Boleyn, and nothing would ever be the same. Anne was not like his previous mistresses. She was not available for casual pleasure. She had seen what happened to her sister Mary, who had warmed the king's bed and been discarded with nothing to show for it but a questionable pregnancy and damaged reputation. Anne wanted more. Anne wanted everything. She would be queen or nothing, and she had the wit and the will to hold Henry at bay until he was so consumed with desire that he would remake the world to have her. What began as infatuation became obsession, and what became obsession became policy. Henry convinced himself, or was convinced by theologians eager for preferment, that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid at all. The verse from Leviticus that prohibited marriage to a brother's wife had never been properly dispensed. The Pope had exceeded his authority in granting the original permission. God's judgment was visible in the death of all those infant princes. Catherine must be put aside, the marriage annulled, and Henry would be free to marry again and beget legitimate sons. This solution seemed simple in 1527. Papal annulments were common enough. Kings had obtained them before for far less compelling reasons. But the politics of 1527 were catastrophically unfavourable. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had just sacked Rome, his armies running wild through the Eternal City in an orgy of destruction and looting that shocked Christendom. The Pope was effectively Charles's prisoner, dependent on imperial goodwill for his safety and his political survival. And Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, devoted to his aunt's honour, absolutely unwilling to see her cast aside for a younger rival. The Pope could not grant Henry's annulment without infuriating the most powerful ruler in Europe, and he would not. Wolsey was caught in the middle, sent to negotiate the impossible, promising results he could not deliver. He delayed and manoeuvred and proposed ingenious compromises that satisfied no one. The king's patience, never abundant, ran out. In 1529, Wolsey was stripped of his offices and properties, Hampton Court seized by the crown, the great cardinal reduced to his archbishopric of York, which he had held for 15 years without ever visiting. He died the following year, on his way to London to face charges of treason. His last words a warning that would prove prophetic. If he had served God as diligently as he had served the king, God would not have abandoned him in his grey hairs. What came next was revolution, though it did not call itself that. Thomas Cromwell, Wolsey's former servant, proposed a solution so audacious that it took Henry's breath away. If the Pope would not grant an annulment, then England would break from the Pope. Parliament would declare the King supreme head of the English Church, with full authority to determine matters of doctrine and discipline, including the validity of royal marriages. No foreign prelate would have jurisdiction in English affairs. The 1,000-year connection with Rome would be severed, and England would go its own way in religion as in politics. This was not initially about Protestant theology. Henry remained Catholic in all essential beliefs. He had written a book defending the 7 sacraments against Luther, and received the title Defender of the Faith from a grateful Pope. He had no sympathy for Protestant heresies about justification, or the Eucharist, or the authority of Scripture. He wanted his annulment, not a reformation of doctrine. But ideas, once unleashed, have a life of their own, and the break with Rome opened a door that could never fully be closed again. The machinery of revolution moved with astonishing speed once the decision was made. In 1532, the submission of the clergy stripped the English Church of its independent legislative power, making convocation subordinate to royal authority. In January 1533, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn, who was already pregnant with the child they both prayed would be a son. In May, Thomas Cranmer, newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, a man chosen precisely because he could be counted upon to deliver the desired verdict, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, never valid, a thing that had never truly existed in the eyes of God or law. Catherine was no longer queen, but merely the Dowager Princess of Wales. The widow of Prince Arthur she had always been. Her daughter Mary was no longer a princess, but a bastard, excluded from the succession, stripped of her household and her dignity. Anne was crowned queen in June, with elaborate pageantry that the London crowds watched in sullen silence. They loved Catherine, who had lived among them for over 20 years, and they saw this dark-eyed usurper as a French whore who had bewitched their king. In September 1533, Anne gave birth. The astrologers had promised a prince. The bonfires and celebrations were already prepared. The letters announcing the birth of a son needed only the date filled in. But Anne delivered a girl, a healthy, red-haired girl with her father's colouring and her mother's sharp intelligence, but a girl nonetheless. They named her Elizabeth, after Henry's mother, and the king's disappointment was profound, though he hid it well in public. There would be other children, he assured himself. Anne was young and evidently fertile. The son would come. Parliament moved to secure the new order. The Act of Supremacy in 1533 declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, with all the powers that title implied. The Act of Succession established Anne's children as the lawful heirs to the throne, displacing Mary entirely. The Treason Act made it a capital offence to deny the king's supremacy, or to call his marriage invalid, or to suggest that Anne was anything other than the true and lawful queen. The realm was required to swear oaths accepting these arrangements, and those who refused faced consequences. Thomas More was among the most prominent who could not bring himself to swear. The former Lord Chancellor, the humanist scholar, the friend of Erasmus, the man Henry had once loved as a companion and trusted as an advisor, More could not in conscience accept the royal supremacy over the church. He did not speak against it publicly, understanding that silence was his only protection, but silence was not enough. The oath required active affirmation, and More's refusal to swear was taken as denial. He was imprisoned in the Tower, tried for treason on perjured testimony, and executed in July 1535. His last words on the scaffold affirmed that he died the king's good servant, but God's first. Bishop John Fisher of Rochester, an elderly scholar who had served as Catherine's confessor and defender, went to the block a few weeks earlier for the same offence. The Pope made Fisher a cardinal while he was awaiting execution. Henry reportedly remarked that he would send Fisher's head to Rome to receive the hat. These executions shocked Catholic Europe and troubled many in England who might otherwise have accepted the new order. More had been the most respected layman in the kingdom, a man whose intellectual achievements and moral integrity were acknowledged even by those who disagreed with him. His death revealed that Henry's Reformation would tolerate no dissent, that the king demanded not merely obedience but complete submission of conscience to royal authority. The principle established in More's trial, that the king had absolute power over his subjects' souls as well as their bodies, would have consequences far beyond the immediate question of papal supremacy. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell was implementing a revolution in government that extended the king's reach into every corner of English life. The vicegerency and spirituals gave Cromwell authority over the church equivalent to the king's own, making him effectively the administrative head of English Christianity. He used this power to conduct visitations of the monasteries, inquiries into religious houses that assessed their wealth, their discipline, their adherence to their rules, and their political reliability. The reports that came back were damning, though their accuracy was questionable. Visitors found financial irregularities, sexual misconduct, lax observance, superstitious practices, relics of dubious authenticity. Whether these abuses were widespread or exaggerated for political purposes remains debated, but the conclusions were foregone. The monasteries were corrupt, their wealth was wasted, their lands could be put to better use. The dissolution began in 1536 with the smaller houses, those with annual incomes under £200. Their lands and properties were surrendered to the crown, their monks and nuns pensioned off or transferred to larger institutions, their buildings stripped of valuables and often demolished. Lead was taken from roofs, bells melted down, timber sold, stones carted away for other construction. Within a few years, communities that had existed for centuries, some since before the Norman conquest, were reduced to picturesque ruins. The great abbeys followed between 1538 and 1540. Glastonbury, Fountains, Rievaulx, Westminster, all the ancient foundations with their accumulated treasures and their vast estates. Abbots who resisted were executed for treason. Those who cooperated received comfortable pensions and sometimes bishoprics. The monks dispersed into the world, some becoming parish priests, others marrying and taking up secular trades, their vows dissolved along with their houses. The wealth that flowed to the crown was enormous. Perhaps 1/5 of all the landed wealth in England changed hands in the dissolution. But Henry did not keep it. Wars with France and Scotland devoured funds as quickly as they arrived. The king's building projects consumed more, and much of the monastic land was sold or granted to nobles and gentry, who became the new owners of abbey estates, men whose fortunes and social positions now depended on the permanence of the religious settlement. A future restoration of Catholicism would threaten their property. They had a vested interest in maintaining the Protestant succession, regardless of their personal beliefs. This redistribution of wealth created a constituency for Reformation that proved more durable than theology. The dissolution changed the physical landscape of England in ways still visible today. Monasteries had been the largest buildings in many regions, centres of hospitality and charity, employers of local labour, markets for local produce. Their destruction left gaps in the social fabric that took generations to fill. The poor who had relied on monastic charity found themselves without support. Roads and bridges that monks had maintained fell into disrepair. Schools and hospitals attached to religious houses closed. Some of this charitable work was eventually taken up by parish churches or by new secular institutions, but the transition was painful and incomplete. The ruins themselves became part of the English imagination, romantic remnants of a vanished world, their broken arches and roofless naves speaking of loss and time's passage, attracting poets and painters centuries later who saw in them a melancholy beauty. For Anne Boleyn, the promised sons never came. She suffered at least one miscarriage, possibly two, and her failure to produce an heir eroded the king's passion as thoroughly as it had once consumed him. By 1536, Henry was already looking elsewhere, his eyes fixed on Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting whose modest demeanour and reported virtue presented a stark contrast to Anne's vivacity and sharp tongue. The charges brought against Anne in May 1536 were almost certainly fabricated. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, conspiracy to murder the king, witchcraft to ensnare his affections. The trials were perfunctory, the verdicts predetermined. Anne was executed on May 19, 1536, her head taken off by a French swordsman specially imported for the purpose, since a sword was thought more merciful than the English axe. Her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate just as Mary had been before her. Henry had now bastardized both his daughters, leaving himself without any legitimate heir. He married Jane Seymour 11 days later. Jane was the opposite of Anne in almost every respect. Gentle where Anne had been fierce, compliant where Anne had been challenging, apparently content to manage her household and please her husband without meddling in politics or pushing religious agendas. She reportedly used her influence to reconcile Henry with Mary, bringing the king's eldest daughter back to court after years of estrangement. though Mary was required to sign documents acknowledging her own illegitimacy, and her parents' marriage had been sinful. It was a humiliation she never forgot and never forgave. Not truly, whatever accommodation she made in the years of her powerlessness. In October 1537, Jane gave Henry what he had wanted for nearly 3 decades: a living son. Edward was born at Hampton Court after a difficult labour that lasted 3 days. The kingdom erupted in celebration. Bells rang, bonfires blazed, Te Deums were sung in every church. Henry wept with joy. But Jane did not recover from the birth. Whether from puerperal fever or simple exhaustion, she declined rapidly and died 12 days later, leaving Henry a widower with the heir he had destroyed so much to obtain. He mourned her genuinely, perhaps more than he had mourned any of his other queens, and when he died 10 years later, it was Jane's body that was placed beside his in the tomb at Windsor. She had given him his son, and for that she remained the wife he remembered with most affection. Edward's birth secured the Tudor succession in male line, but the infant prince was fragile and Henry was no longer young. The king married 3 more times in the decade remaining to him, each marriage a product of political calculation rather than passion. Anne of Cleves, a German Protestant princess, was chosen to cement an alliance with the Lutheran princes of the Schmalkaldic League. Henry had seen only Holbein's flattering portrait before agreeing to the match. When he met Anne in person, he found her appearance disappointing and her German manners alien. The marriage was consummated either inadequately or not at all, the evidence is contradictory, and was annulled after 6 months on grounds of non-consummation and a prior pre-contract with another suitor. Anne accepted the annulment gracefully, received generous estates and a pension, and lived out her days in comfortable obscurity, apparently relieved to have escaped the dangerous honour of being Henry's wife. Catherine Howard followed, a teenager barely out of the schoolroom, a cousin of Anne Boleyn whose family pushed her into the king's bed hoping to regain the influence they had lost. Henry, now grossly overweight, his leg ulcerated with wounds that refused to heal, believed himself rejuvenated by his young bride's affections. But Catherine had a past, flirtations perhaps more with music teachers and secretaries in her youth, and she was indiscreet enough to continue corresponding with former admirers after her marriage. When evidence of her premarital conduct surfaced, Henry was devastated. An investigation revealed not only past misconduct, but possibly ongoing adultery with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Chamber. Catherine was executed in February 1542, not yet 21, her last request reportedly for a block on which to practice laying her head so that she would not falter at the moment of death. Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife, was a different matter entirely. A twice-widowed woman of 31, intelligent, educated, with genuine Protestant sympathies that she was wise enough to express cautiously, Catherine managed what none of her predecessors had achieved. She survived. She served as nurse as much as wife to the aging king, tending his painful leg, managing his household, and taking an active interest in the education of his 3 children. All 3, Mary, Elizabeth and Edward, were restored to the succession by Parliament in 1544, though Mary and Elizabeth remained technically illegitimate, a contradiction that troubled legal theorists but served political necessity. Catherine's Protestant inclinations nearly destroyed her when conservatives at court attempted to charge her with heresy, but she saved herself by submitting tearfully to Henry, assuring him that she had only ever discussed theology to learn from his superior wisdom and to distract him from the pain of his illness. The king was mollified, reportedly embracing her, and declaring that they were perfect friends again. Henry VIII died in the early hours of January 28, 1547 at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old, morbidly obese, his body ravaged by years of excess and the suppurating wound on his leg that had tormented him for over a decade. The cause was probably diabetes complicated by infection, though contemporary accounts spoke of fevers and failing humours. His last coherent words were reportedly a request for Cranmer, who arrived too late to hear a confession, but clasped the dying king's hand and asked for a sign of faith in Christ, receiving a pressure of the fingers in response. The prince who had been the hope of English chivalry, the young athlete who had dazzled foreign ambassadors with his beauty and accomplishments, had become a bloated tyrant whose rages terrified his closest servants and whose whims had reshaped the religious and political landscape of his kingdom beyond recognition. He left England transformed. The break with Rome was irreversible, Whatever individual monarchs might believe about theology, the monasteries were gone, their wealth redistributed, their social functions either abandoned or absorbed by secular institutions. The Bible was available in English, printed and distributed to parish churches throughout the realm, accessible to any literate person in a way it had never been before. The power of the crown had expanded enormously, over the church, over the nobility, over the commons, over every aspect of national life. Parliament had become an essential partner in governance, its statutes providing the legal foundation for religious and political changes that would have been inconceivable a generation earlier. The succession was theoretically settled, but the heir was a child of 9, and those who gathered around the new king's throne had their own agendas, their own ambitions, their own visions of what England should become. Edward VI was intelligent, precocious, and utterly committed to the Protestant faith. His tutors had been selected by his stepmother Catherine Parr and included some of the most advanced reformers in England, men who had read Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, who believed that Henry's Reformation had been incomplete, merely political rather than truly spiritual. They had trained Edward to see the Mass as idolatry, the veneration of saints as superstition, the traditional ceremonies of the Church as popish remnants that obscured the pure gospel of salvation by faith alone. The boy king absorbed these teachings with the passionate certainty of youth, and those who governed in his name, first his uncle Edward Seymour as Lord Protector, later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, were eager to advance the Protestant cause. The Reformation of Edward's reign went far beyond anything Henry had contemplated. The chantries were dissolved, their endowments seized, the priests who had sung masses for the dead pensioned off or absorbed into parish work. The doctrine of purgatory was denied, along with any spiritual benefit from prayers for departed souls. Images were removed from churches, not just the more egregious relics and miracle-working statues, but all images of saints, the roods and crucifixes, the painted walls and stained glass that had made medieval churches blazing with colour and symbolism. Whitewash covered the murals, plain glass replaced the jewelled windows, altars of stone were torn out and replaced with simple wooden tables for a communion service that was now understood as a memorial meal rather than a sacrifice. The Book of Common Prayer, compiled by Cranmer, replaced the Latin Mass with services in English, making the liturgy comprehensible to ordinary people, but stripping away the mystery and beauty that had made worship a sensory experience of the sacred. These changes provoked resistance. In the summer of 1549, risings broke out in several parts of England. In Devon and Cornwall, the Catholic gentry and commons rose in defence of the old religion, demanding the restoration of the Latin Mass, the 6 articles of Henry's reign that had enforced Catholic doctrine, and the punishment of Protestant heretics. The rebels besieged Exeter and were only suppressed after professional troops were brought from the continent, including German and Italian mercenaries who treated English peasants with the brutality reserved for foreign enemies. Thousands died in the fighting and the reprisals that followed. In Norfolk, a different rebellion erupted that summer, led by Robert Kett, a prosperous tanner who became the spokesman for commons protesting enclosure and the loss of traditional grazing rights. Kett's rebellion was not primarily religious. The Norfolk insurgents actually used the new Book of Common Prayer for their services, but it threatened social order and property rights, which the government found equally alarming. The rebels captured Norwich, England's second city, and held it for weeks, before being crushed by forces under the Earl of Warwick. Kett was hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle, his body left to rot as a warning to others who might challenge the established order. These crises brought down the Lord Protector. Edward Seymour had governed with relative moderation, attempting religious change through persuasion rather than persecution, showing some sympathy for the economic grievances of the commons. His fall and subsequent execution in 1552 brought John Dudley to power, a harder man with fewer scruples. Under Dudley's direction, the Reformation accelerated. A second, more Protestant Book of Common Prayer was introduced in 1552, removing any remaining ambiguity about the nature of communion, firmly denying the real presence of Christ in the elements. The 42 Articles of Religion established what would become the doctrinal foundation of Anglicanism, Protestant in theology, while retaining episcopal church government. Church property that had escaped earlier dissolutions was seized. The gold and silver plate of parish churches was confiscated, melted down, and converted to coin for the royal treasury. But Edward's health was failing. The boy, who had been sickly from birth, susceptible to fevers and infections, contracted tuberculosis in 1552. By the spring of 1553, it was clear he was dying. The question of succession became urgent. By Henry's will and parliamentary statute, the crown should pass to Mary, Henry's eldest surviving child, but Mary was Catholic to the marrow of her bones, and everyone knew it. She had never wavered in her devotion to the faith of her Spanish mother, had endured years of persecution and humiliation rather than abandon it, and would certainly attempt to restore papal authority and the old religion if she became queen. For Edward, this was intolerable. To hand England back to the Pope, to see his Reformation undone, to watch his Protestant councillors face the fate of heretics. For Dudley, it was dangerous for more practical reasons. He had made his fortune from monastic lands and Protestant politics. A Catholic restoration could mean ruin or worse. Together, the dying king and his chief minister devised a scheme to alter the succession. Edward's will, drawn up in the last weeks of his life, excluded both his sisters, Mary for her religion, Elizabeth for her questionable legitimacy, and settled the crown on Lady Jane Grey, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII through his younger daughter Mary. Jane was 16, bookish, devoutly Protestant, and conveniently married to Dudley's son Guildford. If Jane became queen, Dudley would be father-in-law to the king, and the Protestant establishment would be secure for another generation. Edward died on July 6, 1553, his last prayer asking God to defend England from papistry. Jane was proclaimed queen in London 4 days later, the crowds receiving the announcement in puzzled silence rather than the expected cheers. Mary was in Norfolk when she learned of her brother's death, and the councillors' plan required her capture before she could rally support. But Mary had been warned. She fled to Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, where the Catholic gentry of East Anglia flocked to her banner. Within days, her forces outnumbered anything Dudley could muster. The council in London, watching the tide turn, abandoned Jane with the same speed they had proclaimed her. Dudley was arrested, tried, and executed. Jane, the 9 days queen, was imprisoned in the Tower along with her young husband, pawns sacrificed when the game was lost. Mary entered London in triumph on August 3, 1553, her sister Elizabeth riding beside her, the streets lined with cheering crowds who welcomed her as Henry's true daughter and rightful heir. She was 37 years old, small and spare, her face prematurely lined by years of anxiety and illness, but her determination was unquenchable. She would restore the old religion, she would reconcile England to Rome, she would undo everything her father and brother had done, return the church to its proper obedience, and save her people's souls, even if she had to burn some of their bodies to do it. The fires began in February of 1555. The first to burn was John Rogers, a scholar and translator who had worked with William Tyndale on the English Bible. He went to his death at Smithfield with such composure that observers remarked he seemed to be walking to his wedding rather than his execution. When the flames rose around him, he washed his hands in them as though they were cold water and died without crying out. His wife and 11 children watched from the crowd, the youngest an infant at the breast. The spectacle was meant to terrify, to demonstrate the fate awaiting those who persisted in heresy. But Rogers's courage had the opposite effect. The crowd wept, and some whispered that they had witnessed a martyrdom. Mary had moved swiftly to restore the old religion. Parliament repealed the religious legislation of Edward's reign, bringing back the Latin Mass, the celibacy of clergy, and the traditional ceremonies that had been suppressed. Married priests were ejected from their livings, forced to choose between their wives and their vocations. The papal legate, Cardinal Reginald Pole, arrived in England in November 1554 to receive the kingdom's formal submission to Rome, absolving the nation of its schism in a ceremony before both houses of Parliament. England was Catholic again, at least in law. But law could not change hearts, and Mary soon discovered that 2 decades of Protestant teaching had taken root in ways that could not be easily uprooted. The heresy laws, dormant since Henry VIII's reign, were revived. The machinery of Inquisition creaked back into motion. Ecclesiastical courts, interrogations, demands for recantation. Those who refused to acknowledge the authority of the Pope and the truth of transubstantiation faced the stake. The fires at Smithfield, at Oxford, at Canterbury, at dozens of market squares throughout southern and eastern England consumed nearly 300 souls over the next 3.5 years. Among them were the most prominent Protestant leaders in the realm: Hugh Latimer, the fiery preacher who had once been Henry VIII's chaplain; Nicholas Ridley, the scholarly bishop who had helped craft Edward's Reformation; and Thomas Cranmer himself, the archbishop who had annulled 2 royal marriages, placed the Bible in English churches, and composed the prayers that generations would speak at baptisms, weddings and funerals. Cranmer's death in March 1556 was the most dramatic of all. Imprisoned, broken, subjected to relentless pressure, the old archbishop had signed recantations, acknowledging the Pope's supremacy and the truth of Catholic doctrine. Mary was determined that he should burn regardless. His crimes were too great for mere submission to a race. But she wanted his public abasement first, a confession that would discredit the Protestant cause. Cranmer was brought to the University Church at Oxford on a rainy March morning to read his final recantation before a packed congregation. But something had changed in him during his last night on earth. Perhaps shame at his weakness, perhaps renewed conviction, perhaps simply the courage that sometimes comes when all hope is gone. When he rose to speak, he departed from the prepared script. He renounced his recantations as lies written in fear, things written with my hand contrary to the truth which I thought in my heart. He declared the Pope to be Christ's enemy and Antichrist, and when the authorities, furious at this defiance, dragged him from the church to the stake, he held out his right hand, the hand that had signed those shameful documents, and thrust it first into the flames, crying, "This unworthy hand." He died with his hand burning before his face, and his death became the centerpiece of Protestant memory, recounted in sermons and pamphlets for generations to come. The burnings accomplished nothing that Mary had hoped and everything she had feared. Instead of terrorizing the population into submission, they created martyrs whose courage and constancy became arguments for the very faith they died professing. John Fox, an exile who had fled to the continent to escape persecution, gathered testimony from witnesses and survivors, assembling a massive record of the Marian persecutions that would be published as the Book of Martyrs after Mary's death. It became the most influential book in England after the Bible itself, read aloud in parish churches, pored over in households, shaping English Protestant identity for centuries. The men and women who burned became saints of a new tradition, their sufferings proof that theirs was the true faith, their persecutors revealed as agents of Antichrist. Mary, who had hoped to save her people's souls, instead earned herself an epithet that would follow her through history: Bloody Mary, the persecutor, the fanatic, the Catholic tyrant. And yet there was pathos in her story too, for Mary was not merely cruel, but desperate, and her desperation extended to every dimension of her life. She needed an heir, both to secure the succession and to vindicate her own suffering. She had been declared illegitimate, cast aside, separated from her mother, humiliated for decades. All of it would be redeemed if she could produce a Catholic heir who would keep England in the faith. In 1554, she had married Philip of Spain, son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and heir to the mightiest empire in Christendom. It was a diplomatic triumph, tying England to the Habsburg alliance against France, and Philip was young, handsome, and charming when he chose to be. Mary was 11 years his senior, had never been beautiful even in youth, and was now a worn woman of 38 with greying hair and bad teeth. She loved him with an intensity that embarrassed her court and bewildered her husband. Philip did his duty, but his attention was elsewhere, on the Netherlands, on Spain, on the great game of European politics in which England was a minor piece. He left England in 1555 and rarely returned, leaving Mary increasingly isolated and melancholy. Twice she believed herself pregnant. The symptoms seemed unmistakable: cessation of her monthly courses, swelling of her belly, the quickening that seemed to promise life within. The court prepared for a birth. Notices were drafted announcing the arrival of an heir, but the months passed and no child came. The swelling subsided. Physicians whispered of phantom pregnancies, of tumours, of the disorders that afflict women past their childbearing years. Mary, who had staked everything on producing an heir, was forced to acknowledge that God had denied her this blessing. Her sister Elizabeth, 22 years old and carefully Protestant in a politic, uncommitted way, remained next in line to the throne. Everything Mary had worked for, the restoration of the faith, the reconciliation with Rome, The burnings that were supposed to purify the kingdom would be undone the moment she died. Her health declined through 1557 and 1558. The fevers that had plagued her since childhood returned with greater frequency. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, her face becoming gaunt, her eyes sinking into their sockets. Philip returned briefly in 1557 to drag England into Spain's war with France, a war that cost England Calais, its last foothold on the continent, a humiliation that cut Mary to the quick. "When I am dead and opened," she reportedly said, "you shall find Calais lying in my heart." She was 42 years old and dying, her life's work collapsing around her. Cardinal Pole, her closest ally in the work of restoration, was dying too, burning with the same fever that consumed his queen. On November 17, 1558, Mary died at St James's Palace, and Pole followed her within hours. They had laboured together to rebuild Catholic England, and they passed from the world together, leaving nothing behind but ashes and memories of fire. Elizabeth was at Hatfield when the news reached her, sitting beneath an oak tree in the November chill, reading, or so the legend says, the New Testament in Greek. The Privy Council arrived on horseback to announce her accession. She fell to her knees in the wet grass and quoted in Latin the words of Psalm 118, "This is the Lord's doing, it is marvellous in our eyes." She was 25 years old, unmarried, unproven, a woman in a world that regarded female rule as an aberration and a danger. Her treasury was empty, her realm was at war with France, her church was divided between Catholics who would never accept her, and Protestants who expected her to complete the Reformation her sister had reversed. The great powers of Europe, Spain, France, the Habsburgs, watched with predatory interest, calculating how this apparently weak and inexperienced queen might be manipulated, controlled, or overthrown. No one expected her to last. No one imagined she would reign for 45 years, defeat the mightiest armada ever assembled, preside over a flowering of literature and exploration unmatched in English history, and die in her bed as the most celebrated monarch since the conquest. She had learned caution in a hard school. As a child, she had been declared a bastard when her mother was executed. As a young woman, she had been imprisoned in the Tower under suspicion of treason against her sister, had lived for months not knowing whether the next knock on her door would bring her death warrant. She had survived by watching, waiting, revealing nothing, trusting no one completely. These habits, formed in fear, became the tools of her statecraft. She would rule as she had survived, through ambiguity, delay, the careful management of faction and faction, never quite committing to any course until the moment forced her hand. Her religious settlement, established in 1559, was a masterpiece of deliberate imprecision. The Act of Supremacy restored royal control over the church, but Elizabeth took the title Supreme Governor rather than Supreme Head, a distinction without much practical difference, but one that acknowledged the objections of those who thought no woman could head a church. The Act of Uniformity imposed a new Book of Common Prayer, based on Cranmer's work but with strategic ambiguities. The words spoken at communion could be understood as affirming the real presence or as denying it, depending on what the communicant chose to believe. The ornaments of worship, vestments, candles, crucifixes, were permitted but not required, allowing parishes to retain Catholic trappings or strip them away as local sentiment dictated. The hot Protestants, returning from exile with continental ideas of church reformation, wanted more. No bishops, no vestments, no kneeling at communion, a church rebuilt from the ground according to Scripture alone. Elizabeth refused them. She liked ceremony, found the Reformed services stark and cold, and had no intention of allowing religious zealots to dictate policy. The church she established was a compromise, a via media that satisfied almost no one completely, but that most people could live with. It would endure in recognisable form for centuries. The great question of her reign was marriage. Every councillor, every parliament, every ambassador urged her to wed. A queen needed a king. A dynasty needed heirs. Without children of her body, England would face another succession crisis, perhaps another civil war when Elizabeth died. The candidates were numerous. The Archduke Charles of Austria, King Philip of Spain, widowed by Mary's death, and willing to marry his former sister-in-law, Eric XV of Sweden, Henry Duke of Anjou, and later his brother the Duke of Alençon. Negotiations were conducted, embassies exchanged, draft treaties composed. Elizabeth encouraged them all, danced and flirted with visiting envoys, accepted costly gifts, allowed negotiations to drag on for years. Yet she never married. The reasons were various and perhaps not entirely clear even to herself. To marry a foreign prince would subordinate England to foreign interests, as Mary's marriage to Philip had done. To marry an English subject would elevate one faction and infuriate the rest. And marriage would mean submission, legal, political, personal, to a husband who would expect to rule. Elizabeth had watched her father discard wives when they displeased him, had seen her mother's head roll on Tower Green. Perhaps she had no appetite for placing herself in any man's power. Instead, she cultivated a mystique of virginity. She was married to England, she said. Her subjects were her children. The imagery of the Virgin Queen, pure and untouchable, merged with older iconography of the Virgin Mary, filling the devotional void left by the Reformation's assault on the saints. Poets compared her to Diana, Astrea, Gloriana. Portraits showed her encrusted with symbolic jewels, her face a mask of white lead and vermilion, ageless and unchanging while the years passed and the wrinkles multiplied beneath the paint. She became an icon, a symbol, something more than human, and the very ambiguity of her status, maiden yet queen, woman yet ruler, became a source of power rather than weakness. The Catholic powers did not cease to threaten her. In 1568, Mary Queen of Scots, Catholic, legitimate in papal eyes, possessing a claim to the English throne through her descent from Henry VII's daughter Margaret, fled her own rebellious subjects and crossed into England seeking Elizabeth's protection. It was the worst possible gift. Mary had been driven from Scotland by Protestant lords who accused her of complicity in her husband's murder, and she was now Elizabeth's prisoner, too dangerous to release, too royal to execute. For 19 years she remained in captivity, a magnet for every Catholic plot against Elizabeth's life. The papal bull of 1570 declaring Elizabeth a heretic and releasing her subjects from their allegiance made every English Catholic a potential traitor in the eyes of the state. Seminary priests trained in France and Rome slipped into England to celebrate Mass in hidden rooms, to maintain the faith among recusant families, and sometimes to promote rebellion. The Jesuit mission of 1580, led by Edmund Campion and Robert Persons, brought the most committed soldiers of the Counter-Reformation to English soil. Campion was captured, tortured, and executed. Persons escaped to continue his work of subversion from abroad. The government responded with increasingly harsh laws, heavy fines for recusancy, death for harbouring priests, elaborate networks of spies and informers under the direction of Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spy master. The plots accumulated through the 1580s, the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Parry plot, the Babington plot, each one aimed at assassinating Elizabeth and placing Mary Stuart on the throne, each one uncovered by Walsingham's agents, each one drawing the noose tighter around Mary's neck. In 1586, Walsingham's spies intercepted letters proving Mary's complicity in the Babington conspiracy. Parliament demanded her death. Elizabeth hesitated, reluctant to execute an anointed queen and her own cousin, knowing that such a precedent could one day be turned against her. But the pressure was relentless, and in February 1587, Mary went to the block at Fotheringhay Castle. It took 3 strokes of the axe to sever her head, and when the executioner lifted it to display to the crowd, the auburn hair came away in his hand, a wig, and Mary's grey head rolled across the scaffold. She was 44 years old, and she had been a prisoner for half her life. The execution made war with Spain inevitable. Philip VII, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, had been planning an invasion of England for years, and Mary's death removed the last restraint. She had named Philip her heir, bequeathing him her claim to the English throne. Now he meant to collect his inheritance. The Armada was assembled through 1587 and early 1588. 130 ships, 30,000 men, the greatest naval force ever launched from European shores. Its mission was to sail up the Channel, collect the Duke of Parma's army from the Netherlands, and transport it across the narrow seas to land on English soil. The beacons were prepared along the southern coast, ready to blaze the alarm from headland to headland. The militia mustered in the shires. Elizabeth herself travelled to Tilbury, where her army encamped against the expected invasion, and delivered the most famous speech of her reign. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. The Armada sailed in late July 1588, a crescent formation stretching across miles of grey water. The English fleet, smaller and faster, could not match the Spanish in close combat, but it harried the great ships with long-range gunnery, preventing them from forming the tight defensive formation they needed. Running battles up the Channel, fireships sent blazing into the Spanish anchorage at Calais, a final engagement off Gravelines where English cannon battered the Spanish hulls but failed to sink them. The Armada was not destroyed by battle but by weather. Driven north by storms, unable to return through the Channel, the Spanish fleet attempted to circle Scotland and Ireland, and there the Atlantic gales accomplished what English guns had not. Ships foundered on rocky coasts, crews drowned or were slaughtered by the Irish when they staggered ashore. Of the 130 ships that had sailed from Lisbon, barely half returned to Spain. Philip, receiving the news in his chamber at the Escorial, allegedly said, "I sent my ships to fight against the English, not against the elements." The defeat of the Armada became the defining moment of Elizabethan mythology. God had sent his winds to scatter the Catholic invaders. England was his chosen nation destined for greatness. A medal was struck bearing the legend, "He blew with his winds and they were scattered." The Queen's birthday became a national holiday, celebrated with bonfires and bell ringing. The remaining 15 years of Elizabeth's reign basked in the glory of that providential deliverance. These were the years of Shakespeare and Marlowe, of Spenser's Fairy Queen, of Raleigh's voyages and Drake's circumnavigation, of the East India Company and the first stirrings of empire. London grew into one of the great cities of Europe, its theatres packed with groundlings and gallants, its presses pouring out plays and pamphlets, its wharves crowded with ships bearing goods from the four corners of the earth. The Elizabethan age became a byword for national confidence, creativity and ambition. Yet Elizabeth herself grew old. The paint grew thicker, the wigs more elaborate, the ceremonies more rigid. Her favourite courtiers died one by one. Leicester in 1588, Walsingham in 1590, Burghley in 1598. She replaced them with younger men, among them Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, a vain and reckless favourite whose disastrous Irish campaign and half-hearted rebellion in 1601 ended with his execution for treason. Elizabeth signed his death warrant as she had signed Mary Stuart's, but Essex's death wounded her in ways that Mary's had not. He had been the last echo of the court romances she had played throughout her reign, and without him the game seemed empty. The succession remained unsettled until the end. Elizabeth never named her heir, never acknowledged what everyone knew, that James VI of Scotland, Mary Stuart's son, Protestant and male, and already a proven king, would follow her. She could not bring herself to name her own successor, to contemplate her own death, to see the courtiers begin paying court to the rising sun while she still reigned. In her last years, she sank into melancholy, sitting for hours in silence, refusing food, declining to go to bed. In March 1603, she took to her chamber at Richmond Palace and did not rise again. Her counsellors gathered around her bed, asking if she accepted James as her heir. She could not speak, but she raised her hands and placed them on her head as though crowning herself. They took it for assent. On March 24th, 1603, between 2 and 3 in the morning, she died. She was 69 years old and had reigned for 44 years. The Tudor dynasty, which had begun in the blood and reign of Bosworth Field, ended in a quiet chamber above the Thames, and a Scottish king rode south to claim an English crown. The century between Bosworth and Richmond had transformed England beyond recognition. A medieval Catholic kingdom, subordinate to Rome in religion and marginal in European politics, had become a Protestant nation-state, confident in its distinct identity, increasingly powerful on the world stage. The monasteries were gone, their lands in the hands of a new gentry class whose interests were permanently tied to the Reformation settlement. The English Bible and the English prayer book had shaped a common culture, a shared language of devotion that crossed class lines. The threat of foreign invasion and Catholic restoration had forged a fierce patriotism, an identification of Protestantism with English liberty that would persist for centuries. Henry VIII had broken with Rome for the sake of a divorce. His children and grandchildren had built something far larger on that breach, a church and a nation that would shape the destinies of continents. Yet the end of the Tudors was also the end of an era, and Elizabeth's death released tensions that her personality and statecraft had contained. The religious settlement that had held Protestant and Catholic alike within a single church would fray under the Stuarts, ultimately tearing the nation apart in civil war. The balance between crown and parliament that Elizabeth had maintained through charm, manipulation, and sheer force of will would collapse into constitutional crisis when her successors lacked her gifts. The golden age that poets celebrated was already passing into memory as James VI of Scotland became James I of England, beginning a new chapter in which the achievements of the Tudors would be remembered, contested, romanticised, and mythologized into the foundation stories of a nation. Elizabeth lies today in Westminster Abbey, her monument raised by James himself, sharing a tomb with the sister who had imprisoned her. Nearby rest Henry VII and his queen, whose cautious diplomacy built the dynasty, Edward VI, the boy king who never reached manhood, and Mary the Fir, whose 5 years of fire left scars that never healed. The chapel is silent now, cool and shadowed, the banners of vanished orders hanging motionless above stone effigies that remember nothing. But the words they spoke, the prayers they wrote, the choices they made in those tumultuous decades still echo through the language and the law, the churches and the institutions, the very sense of what it means to be English. They were mortal, fallible, sometimes monstrous, often magnificent, and they made a world.